Okay, so in this module, we're going to be looking at art. And I think one of the reasons why this is so interesting, for us when we're trying to look critically at the use of the creative arts, both by Aboriginal people, the consumption of that art by both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal audiences, and then also the way in which Aboriginal art is sometimes appropriated by, non-Aboriginal practitioners, is a really interesting area of discussion. So we see these kind of things come up, fairly cyclically in the news, that there will be an example of some kind of iconography that's being sold around depicting either Aboriginal people or Aboriginal art styles. Okay, so let's have a quick look at what some of those art styles are. So things like bark paintings, contemporary art, different forms of multimedia, paintings, photography, sculptures, weaving, and different kinds of works on paper. So some of these take traditional methods, and some of them, in a sense, draw very strongly on contemporary themes as well as contemporary methods of execution. Okay? One of the things that we can see is that Aboriginal artists are, very well regarded in the mainstream art movement. So as we've seen with film, multi-award winning, we can also see this in art as well. So if we look, for instance, in 2018, some of the most significant art prizes in the Archibald Prize were won by Aboriginal people. And, it seems hardly surprising that this should be considered important because, in some works, this is regarded as the oldest art form, not just, in Australia, in the Pacific, but in world history. And, one particular example is art that's shown there, the Bradley cave paintings. Okay, so we can see that, that has gone from, traditional spiritual paintings of figures like Wandjina to, the arrival of Europeans to more, even more contemporary issues. So rock art is certainly not something that is just belonging in the past, but it's also something that, continues to be important. So I spoke on the last tile, about the Wandjina, which is a creation spirit for, a number of Aboriginal groups. And this was quite controversially used in the 2000 Olympic Games. Okay, so one of the custodians from the area did give permission for it to be used. And then, it was used in a couple of different ways. So being projected onto the Opera House, but also shown in the opening of the Olympic Games. Okay, and so for some narratives, this is a way of showing, the interconnectedness of different dreaming journeys across the country and across time. Okay, so we're seeing an example here of how it was used in the 2000 Olympic Games. And we can see too that they've added in the colours of the Aboriginal flag, so the black and then the red at the base and the yellow in the centre. So this again, has become one of the, the best known imagery related to Aboriginal people. But we do see that, for some custodians of these images, they see their use as being a type of cultural appropriation. And we'll see cultural appropriation and Indigenous people, come up fairly often in our media, particularly our social media, whether it's about the usage of Aboriginal art here, or whether, it's about appropriating different fashion styles, sometimes different tattooing styles, particularly from the Pacific, are then appropriated by other people. And so this is, I think, something that's really, really current. We can see that, these things have also been challenged in our courts. So, for instance, there was a 2011 decision to not allow certain engravings to be displayed. Okay. They're also then particularly with things like rock art, comes down to, heritage and protection. Okay, so if we look sort of between the Central Coast and Sydney in the Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, there's a collection of rocks known as the Moon Rock, and that's been given the highest heritage protection by the New South Wales government. Okay, and then, we see around that a whole range of protocols and signage that starts to develop. So not just in New South Wales, we see other examples of Aboriginal rock sites that are compared to Stonehenge in their ability to map astronomical trajectories. So these, I think, are really significant nationally. All right, so when we look at some of the symbols that have become really well known, particularly in forms of Aboriginal art, like, dot art on canvas and those kind of things. Many of those styles actually originated in sand drawing and rock work. Okay, so they've been adapted, not just to, different mediums like canvas, but also different colours as well. And then we can see similarly that, when you look at certain types of bark painting, that different types of cross-hatching, so the small lines, actually are a signature of not just different artists, but different peoples and places. So, it becomes very important that we don't appropriate those, because just simply in the way that they're formed, they start to tell a story. In terms of, things like tools, many of, artifacts, many of these were painted, and painted with stories that are significant to the individual artist or to their group. Okay, so things were adorned, bodies were adorned with story, implements were adorned with story. And then we can also see, some of the weaving that was done. So we now see, quite a lot of examples of different types of weaving and Fibrecraft, which are displayed as being examples of, Aboriginal aesthetics, Aboriginal art. And I think that that's quite significant as well, to see this change from it being, considered something practical to a different way of looking at it. We can also see, quite a lot of carving. So carved trees, scarified, sometimes referred to as scarified trees. These are quite common, but also carving into things like emu eggs, as well as the implements, are often used as a means of promoting culture. Okay. Now, one of the things that becomes problematic in how we look at these kind of ideas is, is the display of designs on the body, a type of artistic representation, or is it a cultural representation? Should we be able to simply reproduce those patterns? And most people, argue that, those are very individualised. So much like, say, some of the Māori tattoos, we also see this in, Aboriginal images and Aboriginal tattooing. Okay, so it's become common in schools to use certain, types of images, in your primary school art, your NAIDOC event. is this problematic? Is it problematic that dot art has become, such a staple of, say, your school's NAIDOC activities? Okay, so we start to then think about stories and the dotting. Is this secret or sacred? Has it changed over time? Is it now a characteristic of Aboriginal art? Okay, or, some people have sort of said, well, a particular culture can't own something like a dot. Dots exist across multiple cultural realms. And of course that's true. But I do think that, sometimes these collection of dots are used to try and convey a particular cultural meaning. When that happens, we need to think carefully about whether we're appreciating or appropriating. Okay? So if we look in mainstream art, we see these historical depictions of, in inverted commas, the Aborigine. Okay? So comedic artists like Eric Jolliffe, early convict paintings, if we look in the bottom left-hand corner there of Joseph Lysett, we see examples of advertisements. And quite often these focused on Aboriginal men. And they also, often had a real fascination for what was termed, the last of a certain tribe, or the last of a dying race. So there was a sense in which some of this art is, supposed to be ethnographic. Okay. We also see, examples of Aboriginal people in early colonial paintings. Sometimes, these were quite sympathetic. Sometimes they were not. Okay, but almost always what we see is quite an idyllic depiction of colonial life. And, anyone who's done colonial history would know that, that definitely wasn't the case, particularly for the majority of people. So if we look in the 20th century, one of the names in Aboriginal art that, many people would have been familiar with was the figure of Albert Namitjira and what was called the Hermannsburg School art movement. Okay, so Namitjira was known for his watercolours, okay, and, there were various pushes to allow him and his wife, different rights under citizenship. Okay, we know that was, later used against him, and that, in fact, the copyright on many of his works has been denied, for a good 50 years to his family, and that has only recently been returned. But certainly, if we look in the era when many people, through their schooling and through their own life experiences, had very little interaction with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they would have recognised an Albert Namitjira painting, just simply by its style. And we can also see that, art has been used to depict certain political perspectives, so this is an Aboriginal statement. So these kinds of borders that are used, for instance, in the 1963 Yirrkala bark petitions, was really a way of marking out, not just to other Aboriginal people, but to government, to the broader community, that Aboriginal law and Aboriginal connection to country and ongoing heritage, was a legitimate way to frame some of the political claims which Aboriginal people were making at the time. Okay, so they were making claims about land rights, These petitions were also written in both English and also in the artist and political agitators' languages. Okay, so again, looking at a political artist, Trevor Nickolls, is seen as being someone who brought in not just modern but postmodern forms of representation, okay, and then blended that with some of the traditional forms. So looking here at a piece of his art, Maralinga Man from 2010. So Maralinga was a site of British nuclear testing, and that land has been given back to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And in many areas, they've been told that, that's now safe to live on. Yeah, not sure that I really believe that. Okay, another artist, also moving into some of this, what's called agitational propaganda, or agitprop for short. Trying to make political messages, making them in a way that, is really multifaceted. So an example of that is the work of Gordon Bennett, which is, really talks very strongly about issues of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I guess not just physical violence, but also epistemic violence. So the violence that comes out of knowledge and how we represent people. And then what we also see is, some examples I think that are incredibly controversial. So we've talked in the last couple of modules, we've made reference to Becky Cole. And, in this particular piece, it's meant to be shocking. It is, meant to make people, stop and think about the world. It's meant to be confronting. And, for some people, that is the purpose of art, okay? Now, when we look at exploitation, we can see that, there's quite a number of stories about Aboriginal artists who work for very little money and whose work is then taken by what are called carpetbaggers, so a term from the United States. So people who come in and take that work and resell it for, vast increases in profits. And, we can see some examples of Aboriginal paintings that now fetch record sums of money. So there's a news article here on a work by Clifford Possum Japutjari, okay, which in 2004, sold for $2.4 million, which at the time, and I mean even today, was, a very high amount compared to previous sales, okay? We can see that in places like the Art Gallery of New South Wales, that they maintain a very strong Indigenous gallery, and that's something that, if you have access to Sydney, that you might like to go and see, to support your learning in this course. We can also see some other examples in places like the Museum of Contemporary Art. Many of these pieces in the Museum of Contemporary Art tend, to be very political and often very confronting. And this sometimes, generates media coverage that is sort of less than favourable. So we need to be aware that Aboriginal art, while there is much greater acceptance in the art world and in the mainstream population, we do have to be aware that this is certainly not universal, okay? And we also need to be aware of the diversity of Indigenous peoples and representations. and making sure that we do differentiate, so acknowledging what people an artist is from, if possible. Okay. And we can also see that museums have also become an important repository for different, what are termed ethnographic objects. So cultural objects that also, have an artistic, narrative around them as well.